The sun in Bali doesn't just shine, it glows with a kind of warmth that makes you believe, even for a second, that the world is finally at peace with you. I remember sitting on the balcony of our small villa, watching the tide pull back from the shore, thinking that I had finally earned the right to breathe. My husband, Mark, was still asleep inside, exhausted from the months of planning and the years of grinding that it took to get us to this specific moment. This wasn't a luxury honeymoon. We weren't influencers or trust fund kids. We were just two people who had spent our entire 20s saying no to ourselves so we could say yes to everyone else. My hand still felt the ghost of the steering wheel from my third job as a delivery driver, a side hustle I kept long after my career as a realtor took off, because my parents always seemed to be one minor inconvenience away from total financial collapse. I looked at my phone tucked away in my beach bag and felt a rare sense of pride. For 10 years, that phone had been a tether to my parents' endless emergencies. In my early 20s, while my friends were out at bars or buying their first cars, I was sitting in a dimly lit office at 11 p.m. doing data entry. I did it because my mother would call me crying, claiming the property taxes were going to result in a foreclosure. I did it because my father would send me photos of a broken water heater, claiming they'd be bathing in ice water if I didn't send $2,000 by Friday. I was the family safety net, the one who never questioned the cost of loyalty. I viewed that house, my childhood home, as a sacred trust. It was the place where I learned to walk, the place where we celebrated every Christmas, and the place I had personally kept afloat with over $100,000 of my own post-tax income. I didn't mind the sacrifice back then. I told myself that keeping the family legacy alive was worth the missed vacations and the cheap ramen dinners. I was the good daughter. I was the one who could be counted on. Sitting there in the Balinese heat, I felt like the debt had finally been paid. Mark and I had saved for 3 years for this 2-week escape. We had worked through holidays and skipped birthdays just to afford these 14 days of silence. My parents had even hugged me at the airport, my mother dabbing at her eyes, telling me how much I deserved this rest after everything I had done for them. I believed her. I actually believed that they saw me as a person rather than a line of credit. The first 4 days were perfect. We turned off our notifications and let the salt water wash away the stress of the city. I thought the worst thing I'd have to deal with was a slight sunburn or a delayed flight home. On the 5th morning, the silence was broken. My phone started vibrating on the wooden table, the buzzing sound cutting through the peaceful morning like a chainsaw. I ignored it at first, assuming it was a telemarketer or a stray work email. But then it buzzed again. And again. 6 times in a row. A knot of familiar anxiety tightened in my chest. I reached for the device, expecting to see a dozen missed calls from my mother claiming the roof was leaking or the car had died. But it wasn't my parents. The screen showed the name of Mrs. Gable, the retired schoolteacher who lived across the street from my childhood home for 30 years. She was a sweet woman who usually only called to tell me when my parents' dog had gotten loose or to thank me for the flowers I sent her every spring. I picked up, my voice still thick with sleep and a lingering sense of calm. I honestly thought she was calling to congratulate me on the wedding or to ask when we'd be back so she could bring over a casserole. I was ready to laugh and tell her about the beaches and the food. I was ready for a pleasant, normal conversation. I thought the neighbor was calling to congratulate me. Instead, she asked why there was a sold sign on my front lawn and a moving truck in the driveway. I sat there on the edge of the bed, the humid air of the villa suddenly feeling like it was crushing the lungs right out of my chest. Mark stirred beside me, sensing the shift in my posture, but I couldn't even look at him. My hands were shaking so violently that I almost dropped the phone as I dialed my mother's number. I expected a panicked explanation, or perhaps another one of her elaborate lies about a banking error. Instead, she picked up on the second ring, her voice sounding lighter and more cheerful than I had heard it in years. She didn't even wait for me to say hello before she started talking about how lucky the weather was for moving day. There was no shame in her tone, no hesitation, just a terrifyingly casual entitlement that made my stomach turn. When I finally found my voice, I asked her what Mrs. Gable was talking about. I asked her why there were strangers carrying our family memories into a truck while I was 5,000 miles away. My mother sighed, that weary, dramatic sound she used whenever I was being difficult. She told me to calm down and stop being so sensitive. She explained, as if speaking to a slow child, that since I was married now, I had a new life and a new husband to take care of me. They didn't want to burden me with the upkeep of the big house anymore, so they decided it was time to downsize. She spoke about the house as if it were a pair of old shoes they had outgrown, completely ignoring the fact that the only reason they still owned those shoes was because I had spent a decade paying for the soles and the laces. I reminded her, my voice cracking, that I had poured every spare cent of my life into that mortgage. I reminded her of the 3 jobs, the missed milestones, and the legal promises we had made about my equity. She brushed it off with a sharp laugh. She told me that the house had sold for a massive profit, far more than they expected, and that they needed that money for their next chapter. The gaslighting was surgical. She told me that they had given me a beautiful childhood in that home, and that should be payment enough for any daughter. She actually asked me if I was so greedy that I would begrudge my own parents a comfortable retirement after all the sacrifices they made raising me. It was a total inversion of reality. They were the ones who had lived off my labor, yet they were framing me as the one who was taking from them. I tried to argue, to bring up the receipts and the bank transfers, but she wasn't listening. She was already mentally spending the hundreds of thousands of dollars that belonged to my future. She told me I should be happy for them, that a good daughter would be proud to see her parents finally winning. I felt a cold, hollow sensation spreading through my limbs. I realized then that I wasn't a person to them. I was just a resource they had finished harvesting. I was about to hang up and call my lawyer when she added one final detail, her voice dropping into that sweet, manipulative purr she used when she wanted a favor. But then my mother said the words that turned my blood to ice. Since you're a realtor, we used your license number to save on fees. So where's our family discount? I didn't hang up the phone. I couldn't. I just lowered it slowly until it rested on the cool linens of the bed, my mother's voice still tinny and distant, prattling on about the granite countertops in their new condo. Mark was awake now, sitting up and watching me with a look of pure alarm, but I held up a hand to silence him. I needed to see it. I needed to see the numbers. I opened my laptop, the screen's harsh blue light clashing with the soft Balinese sunrise, and I logged into my primary bank portal. My breath was shallow as I navigated to the search filters, setting the date range back 10 years to the very month I had graduated and moved into my first cramped studio apartment. I started a new spreadsheet. I titled it simply The Cost of Home. At first, the entries were small, $300 here for a broken refrigerator, $500 there for a heating bill they claimed they couldn't cover. I remember those days. I was working 40 hours a week as a junior agent and another 20 at a call center. I lived on coffee and anxiety, convinced that if I didn't send that money, my parents would be on the street. But as I scrolled, the numbers began to swell and mutate. In 2016, there was a transfer for $8,000. I searched my old emails for that date. There it was. An urgent, tear-filled message from my father claiming he needed a specialized dental surgery that insurance wouldn't touch. Looking at the bank records now, the recipient wasn't a surgeon. It was a local contractor who had installed a custom deck on the back of the house. I was no longer allowed to enter. I felt a sickening lurch in my stomach, but I kept typing. The keys clicked rhythmically, a funeral march for my bank account. In 2017, I sent $12,000 across 4 months because they told me the county was threatening a tax lien. I had stayed home from a friend's wedding in Italy that year because I couldn't afford the flight after saving my parents' legacy. I found the transfers, but when I cross-referenced the property tax history on the public county website, a tool I used every day for my actual clients, I saw the truth. The taxes had been paid on time for years with a standard senior exemption. My money hadn't gone to the government. It had vanished into their lifestyle. Every time I had felt guilty for buying a new pair of shoes or taking Mark out for a nice dinner, I had been subsidizing a fantasy. I documented the $50,000 I provided for the foundation repair in 2019, a repair that the neighbor, Mrs. Gable, had told me at the time she never saw a crew perform. I had ignored my gut back then because I wanted to be the hero. I wanted to be the daughter who saved the day. I was so busy being the saint that I never realized I was just the mark in a decade-long con. I was auditing my own life and the deficit was staggering. It wasn't just the money. It was the time, the stress, and the gray hairs I had developed at 26 because I thought my parents were drowning. The most devastating realization came when I reached the entries from 5 years ago. I remember that summer vividly. I had been working 3 jobs, surviving on 4 hours of sleep, and skipping meals to ensure they didn't lose the house during what they called a market catastrophe. They told me they were weeks away from an eviction notice. I sent them $15,000 in a single week, draining my entire emergency fund and pushing my credit cards to the limit. I had cried myself to sleep that night, praying it would be enough to keep the roof over their heads. I found that specific transfer in the ledger, a bold black line of text that represented my absolute breaking point. I looked at the date, then I pulled up my mother's old social media posts from that same month, which I had archived years ago. As I scrolled back to 2018, I realized the property tax crisis I paid for was actually a luxury cruise for them, and I had the receipts to prove it. The flight back from Bali was a 14-hour blur of recycled air and cold fury. Mark held my hand the entire time, his thumb tracing circles over my knuckles in a rhythmic attempt to keep me grounded. He didn't say much, and I loved him for that. He knew that words were useless against the mountain of betrayal I was currently climbing. He had watched me work those 3 jobs. He had been the one to make me toast at midnight when I came home from the call center too tired to chew. He had seen the saintly patience I had practiced for years, and now he was watching the light behind my eyes go out, replaced by a cold, hard stare that even frightened me. While he was quietly looking up earlier flights and coordinating the cancellation of our remaining villa nights, I was watching my phone screen light up with a series of notifications that felt like physical blows. My parents weren't calling to apologize. They weren't even checking to see if I was okay. Instead, my mother had sent a series of Venmo requests. She wanted $400 for the closing gifts she had purchased for the buyers. Premium gift baskets she claimed were necessary to ensure the deal went through smoothly. She also requested $200 for the professional cleaning crew she hired to scrub away the years of grime before the new owners moved in. Each notification was a fresh insult, a testament to her belief that my bank account was an infinite resource she was entitled to tap, even while she was in the middle of robbing me of my heritage. Mark saw one of the requests pop up and I felt his entire body stiffen. He didn't reach for the phone. He just looked at me and whispered that we were going to fix this. He was the partner I deserved, the one who actually valued my labor, while my parents were the monsters who saw my sweat as their liquid assets. We landed at 6 a.m., the gray morning light of the city a stark contrast to the vibrant greens we had left behind. We didn't even go to our apartment first. We took a taxi straight to my childhood home, our suitcases rattling in the trunk. I needed to see it. I needed to see if the world I knew still existed. As the car pulled onto my old street, the sight of the house hit me like a physical wall. The oak tree I used to climb was still there, and the flower beds I had spent my weekends weeding were still neatly edged. But everything else was wrong. There was a sleek modern SUV in the driveway where my father's beat-up truck used to sit. A bright, colorful wreath that I didn't recognize hung on the front door. The sold sign Mrs. Gable had mentioned was gone, replaced by the smug silence of a completed transaction. I walked up the path, my footsteps sounding heavy on the concrete I had paid to have power washed just last summer. I reached for my key, a reflexive habit born of 20 years of belonging. I slid it into the lock, but it wouldn't turn. I tried again, jiggling the metal, a desperate part of my brain hoping it was just stuck. But the cylinder was tight and new. They hadn't just sold the house. They had erased my access to it before the ink was even dry on the contract. I stood there, staring at the brass hardware, realizing that my childhood bedroom, the closet where I kept my old yearbooks, and the kitchen where I had made 1,000 cups of tea for my exhausted parents were now the property of strangers. I could hear muffled voices inside, the sound of a new family starting their life in the shell of mine. Standing on the sidewalk of my own life, I didn't cry. I called my lawyer. It was time to stop being a daughter and start being a creditor. By the time I reached the sidewalk, my phone wasn't just buzzing, it was screaming. My parents had realized that their family discount wasn't coming, and that I had officially engaged legal counsel to freeze the escrow funds. In their world, a victim fighting back is the ultimate act of aggression. They didn't retreat in shame or offer a private sit-down to discuss the hundreds of thousands of dollars I had funneled into their pockets. Instead, they took the coward's route. They went public. My mother, a woman who spent half her life cultivating an image of the long-suffering matriarch, posted a photo on Facebook. It was a grainy, filtered picture of me as a toddler sitting on the front porch of the house. The caption was a masterpiece of manipulative fiction. She wrote about how heartbreaking it was to realize that your only child valued money over family. She claimed that they were being evicted by their own daughter, and that I was suing my elderly, vulnerable parents over what she called a mere pile of bricks. Within an hour, the flying monkeys began to circle. In family psychology, these are the third parties the narcissist recruits to do their dirty work, and my extended family was a well-trained squadron. These were aunts, uncles, and cousins who hadn't contributed a single dime to the house, people who hadn't seen my parents in years, yet felt fully qualified to judge the daughter who had carried the entire family on her back. My phone became a graveyard of hateful messages. My Uncle Bob sent a text saying he hoped I was happy knowing I was sending my father to an early grave. My cousin Sarah, who I had helped with a security deposit 2 years ago, messaged me to say that karma is real, and that my greed would eventually destroy my own marriage. They didn't have the facts, but they had the narrative, and in the court of social media, the loudest sob story usually wins. I sat in the passenger seat of our car, scrolling through comments from people I used to spend Thanksgiving with. They were calling me a heartless professional and a money-hungry shark. The contrast was nauseating. I was the one who had worked 60-hour weeks so my parents could live in a home they couldn't afford. I was the one who had sacrificed my own savings, my own travel, and my own peace of mind. And yet, here were my parents, painting themselves as the helpless victims of a cold-blooded realtor daughter. They were weaponizing the very career I had built, the career that paid for their lifestyle, to make me look like a villain. The entitlement was so thick I could almost taste it. They truly believed that because they had given birth to me, I owed them my entire financial future, and any attempt to reclaim my own life was a betrayal of the highest order. The peak of the madness came when my Aunt Linda called. Linda was my mother's sister and the self-appointed moral compass of the family. She didn't even say hello. She just started screaming the moment I picked up, her voice distorted by a mix of genuine rage and performative indignation. She told me that I was a disgrace to the family name. She said that my parents had worked themselves to the bone to give me a roof over my head, and now that they were old and tired, I was trying to rob them of their peace. She used the word monster at least 4 times in the first minute. She told me that no amount of money was worth ruining their retirement, and that I would die alone if I didn't drop the lawsuit immediately and apologize for the embarrassment I had caused them. I listened to her breathe for a second, feeling a strange, icy calm settle over me. 4 years, I had stayed silent to protect the family's image. I had let them lie to the relatives about how they were managing just fine, while secretly cashing my checks. I realized that the only reason they were winning this public relations war was because I was the only one playing by the rules of family privacy. They were using my silence as a shield. I told Linda very quietly that she had no idea what she was talking about. I told her that my parents hadn't paid for that house in a decade. I told her that I had a digital folder containing every single transfer, every fraudulent medical bill, and every lie they had ever told me to extract cash. I told her I was about to post the spreadsheet. She laughed, a high-pitched, mocking sound, and told me that no one would believe a liar like me, and that I didn't have the guts to shame my own flesh and blood. She dared me, so I hit upload. I didn't just post a status update. I published a reckoning. I spent 3 hours in a coffee shop near our apartment, the air smelling of roasted beans and my own adrenaline, as I finalized the document that would end the Saint Mother myth forever. I called it the absolute equity audit. It wasn't an emotional plea. It was a cold, clinical, and devastatingly detailed forensic accounting of 10 years of financial parasitic behavior. I pinned it to the top of my profile and tagged every single family member who had spent the morning dragging my name through the mud. I wanted them to see the math. I wanted them to realize that while they were enjoying holiday dinners at that house, I was the one paying for the heat that kept them warm and the table they sat at. The spreadsheet was divided into 4 distinct phases of theft. Phase 1 was the direct mortgage support. I listed every payment from 2015 to 2025 where I had covered the primary note to prevent a default. Total: $182,000. I attached the bank confirmation numbers as footnotes. Phase 2 was the maintenance and capital improvements. I included the invoices for the new roof in 2021, the HVAC system I replaced in 2022, and the foundation work from 2019 that my father had lied about. I noted that these improvements were the literal reason the house had appraised so high for the secret sale. My labor had created the very profit they were now trying to pocket. Total: $94,000. Phase 3 was the emergency extraction. The medical bills for surgeries that never happened, the property tax crises that were actually vacation funds, and the legal fees for my father's imaginary car accident. Total: $76,000. Finally, Phase 4 was the opportunity cost, the interest I lost by not having that money in my own retirement accounts or invested in my own property. The grand total, when all the interest and direct payments were tallied, was $454,321. That was the price of my loyalty. That was the cost of being a good daughter. I made sure to highlight the contrast in the final column. While I was living in a one-bedroom rental with a leaking ceiling to save their home, my parents were using my emergency funds to buy jet skis and go on cruises. I posted side-by-side screenshots of my transfer receipts and their public vacation photos from the exact same dates. The visual of my bank account hitting zero, while they were holding margaritas on a deck in the Caribbean, was the final nail in the coffin. It was no longer a family dispute. It was a documented heist. The reaction was instantaneous. The flying monkeys, who had been so vocal an hour ago, suddenly went silent. My Aunt Linda, the woman who had called me a monster, didn't reply to the tag. She didn't have to. The evidence was irrefutable. I watched as the likes on my mother's manipulative post began to vanish. People weren't just reading the numbers, they were sharing them. Local friends, former neighbors, and even distant relatives I hadn't spoken to in years began to comment. The narrative shifted from ungrateful daughter to exploited child in the span of a few hundred clicks. One of my mother's bridge club friends commented, "This is sickening. We all thought you were paying for this yourselves." Another neighbor wrote, "I saw the pool guys there last summer and wondered how you guys afforded on a fixed income. Now we know. You were stealing from your own kid." The audit worked because it removed the emotion from the room and replaced it with a ledger. You can argue with a daughter's feelings, but you cannot argue with a bank-stamped transaction ID. My parents had relied on the fact that most people find talking about money tacky or private. They thought I would be too embarrassed to admit how much they had taken from me. They counted on my shame. But they forgot that I'm a realtor. I live and breathe contracts, appraisals, and closing costs. I know exactly what a house is worth, and I know exactly what a betrayal costs. I sat back and watched the notifications roll in, watching the family group chat dissolve into a chaotic mess of people demanding explanations that my parents couldn't give. The most satisfying part wasn't the public vindication, though. It was the sudden, desperate silence from my parents' side. My mother's Facebook page was suddenly set to private, but it was too late. The screenshots were already circulating through the community. The poor, elderly parents were now being seen for what they were: sophisticated financial predators who had used their child as a private ATM for a decade. They had tried to use the court of public opinion to shame me into dropping my legal claim, but they had accidentally provided me with the perfect platform to expose their entire fraudulent lifestyle. The internet doesn't forgive a thief, especially one that tweets from a beach house bought with stolen money. The tide started to turn. The silence following the audit didn't last as long as I'd hoped. 3 days after the spreadsheet went viral, the reality of their social exile finally curdled into a desperate, frantic rage. I was sitting in our small rental kitchen, finally trying to eat a real meal, when the first heavy thud hit the front door. It wasn't a knock, it was a strike. I didn't need to look at the monitor to know who was standing in the hallway. I could hear my father's heavy, labored breathing and my mother's sharp, rhythmic pacing. They hadn't come to negotiate, and they certainly hadn't come to apologize. They had come because the bank had finally frozen the escrow account based on my attorney's emergency filing, and the commission they thought they were owed was the only thing left in their sights. I stayed in my chair, my heart hammering against my ribs, watching the feed on my phone. My mother was dressed in her best Sunday coat, her face twisted into a mask of indignant fury. She looked directly into the camera lens, her eyes cold and calculating. She didn't lead with love. She led with a bill. She started screaming through the wood that I was a traitor to my profession. Her logic, warped by years of entitlement, was that because I am a licensed realtor, I had a fiduciary and familial obligation to handle the sale of their home for free. Since they had been forced to use an outside firm to keep the sale a secret from me, they had lost 3% of the purchase price in commission fees. In her mind, that $15,000 was a debt I personally owed them. She actually shouted that I was stealing that commission from their retirement by making them pay a stranger to do a job I should have done as a gift. It was a staggering display of mental gymnastics. They had sold the house I paid for in secret while I was on my honeymoon, and now they were demanding I pay them for the cost of their own deception. My father joined in, his voice a gravelly roar that echoed down the quiet apartment hallway. He didn't care about the real estate math. He went straight for the emotional jugular. He began listing every cent he had ever spent on me since the day I was born. He shouted about the braces he paid for in middle school, the used car he bought me when I was 16, and every gallon of milk that had ever sat in the fridge. He was trying to audit my childhood to justify his theft of my adulthood. The contrast was sickening. I was holding receipts for hundreds of thousands of dollars in actual mortgage principal, and he was screaming about the cost of a Happy Meal from 1998. I watched Mark move toward the door, his face dark with protective anger, but I grabbed his arm and shook my head. I whispered for him to stay back. I knew that if we opened that door, we would be giving them exactly what they wanted. A scene they could later describe as an attack. They wanted me to scream back. They wanted me to lose my composure so they could tell the remaining family members that I had assaulted them in their time of grief. I refused to give them the satisfaction of a conversation. I sat in the dim light of the kitchen, watching the digital recording of my parents' total moral collapse. They stayed for nearly 40 minutes. My mother eventually gave up on the commission argument and started kicking the base of the door, calling me a shameful girl, and telling me she wished she had never kept the house if it meant raising a snake. My father's voice finally started to crack, not from sadness, but from the sheer exertion of his tantrum. He made one final desperate play, leaning his face so close to the doorbell camera that I could see the veins bulging in his neck. My father pounded on the door, screaming that I owed him for 20 years of groceries. I didn't open the door. I let the doorbell camera record everything. The office of my attorney, Mr. Sterling, was a sterile fortress of glass and mahogany, the kind of place where emotions go to die and facts are the only currency. I sat across from him with my hands folded in my lap, feeling the heavy weight of the doorbell camera footage, and my printed spreadsheet sitting on his desk. I had spent so long being told I was the problem, that I was the one being difficult, greedy, or delusional, that I had almost started to believe it. But as Sterling began to flip through the closing documents he had subpoenaed from the title company, the air in the room shifted. He wasn't just nodding politely. He was frowning, his brow furrowing deeper with every page he turned. For the first time in a decade, I wasn't the only one looking at the truth. He pulled a specific document from the stack. A gift letter dated 3 years ago. This was a form required by the bank to verify that the large sums of money I was transferring into their account were no-obligation gifts, and not loans that would affect their debt-to-income ratio. My heart stopped. I had never seen this document in my life. I had never signed it. Sterling slid it across the desk toward me, his pen pointing to a signature at the bottom that looked hauntingly like mine, but with a slight, shaky hesitation in the loop of the P. I felt a wave of nausea. They hadn't just taken my money. They had stolen my legal identity to ensure the bank wouldn't ask questions about where the unemployed homeowners were getting $50,000 for a foundation repair that never happened. Sterling leaned back in his leather chair, the springs creaking in the silence. He told me that this changed everything. In his 20 years of real estate law, he had seen plenty of ugly family squabbles over inheritances, but he had rarely seen parents systematically set up their own child as a shield for a decade-long financial scam. He pointed out that by forging this letter, they had essentially tricked a federally insured lending institution into believing their assets were legitimate. The contrast between my saint behavior, working myself to the bone to save them, and their monster behavior, committing a crime to keep the con alive, was now a matter of public record. I wasn't just a daughter who had been mistreated. I was the primary victim of a multi-layered fraud. The room felt cold. The third-party validation I had craved for years didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like a finality. It was the sound of the last bridge burning. Sterling explained that because this involved a mortgage and a bank, the jurisdiction moved beyond a simple civil, lawsuit to recover my equity. This was no longer just about the $450,000 or the secret sale of my childhood home. This was about the integrity of the financial system they had manipulated. He closed the folder with a sharp, decisive thud and looked at me with a professional pity that made my skin crawl. The lawyer looked at me and said, "This isn't just a family feud, OP. This is felony mortgage fraud. Do you want to press charges?" The meeting room for the settlement was drained of the warmth and false nostalgia that had defined my life for 30 years. My parents sat on the opposite side of the table, stripped of their social media bravado and their neighborhood influence. They didn't look like the confident, entitled homeowners who had sold my heritage behind my back. They looked small, gray, and desperate. The legal hammer had finally shattered their delusions. My attorney had made the terms of the settlement brutally clear. They could either sign over the entirety of the sale proceeds to me, the full $450,000, or we would hand the file over to the district attorney for a criminal fraud prosecution. There was no middle ground. There was no family discount. There was only the cold, hard debt of a decade of theft finally coming due. My mother's hands were trembling as she looked at the signature line. This money was supposed to be their golden year's nest egg. It was the profit they had harvested from my youth, the cash they intended to use to live a life of leisure in a luxury condo while I struggled to rebuild my own savings. By signing this document, they weren't just returning what they stole, they were signing away their comfort. They were losing the ability to ever own a home again. They were being forced to move into a tiny, cramped one-bedroom rental on the edge of town. A place with linoleum floors and thin walls, the exact kind of starter existence they had tried to force on me while I was busy paying their mortgage. The irony was a heavy, suffocating presence in the room. They had tried to trade my future for their luxury, and now they were being left with nothing but the consequences of their own greed. I watched as my father stared at the wall, refusing to meet my eyes. He was the man who had screamed about 20 years of groceries through my doorbell camera just a week ago. Now he was silent. He knew that the receipts I held were more powerful than any emotional tantrum he could throw. Every time I had skipped a meal to ensure they had theirs, every time I had worked a double shift to pay for their emergencies, it had all led to this table. The contrast was absolute. I had been the selfless provider, and they had been the parasitic consumers. They had treated my love as a commodity to be traded, and today the market had crashed. The total collapse of their lifestyle was not an act of cruelty on my part. It was a simple balancing of the ledger. My attorney slid the pen toward my mother. She picked it up like it weighed 100 pounds. As the ink hit the paper, I felt a strange sense of detachment. I expected to feel a surge of triumph, but instead I just felt a profound sense of relief that the audit was finally over. The house was gone, the memories were tainted, but the financial tether that had strangled me for my entire adult life was being cut. They had nothing left to take from me. They had spent 10 years convincing me that I was the one who owed them, but as the final page was initialed, the truth was officially codified into law. They owed me everything. When the last document was signed, the room stayed quiet for a long moment. My father stood up and walked out without a word. His shoulders slumped, heading toward a future of rent payments and restricted budgets. My mother lingered for a second, her face a mask of bitterness and directed spite. She leaned across the table, the scent of her expensive perfume, likely bought with my money, hitting me one last time. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't offer a hug. She chose to cling to her role as the victim until the very end. As they signed the final settlement, my mother whispered, "You've destroyed this family." I looked her in the eye and said, "No, I just audited it." The air in the Maldives is different when you aren't checking your bank account every 20 minutes to see if a parent has drained your future. Mark and I are back on the water, actually finishing the honeymoon that was stolen from us, but this time the silence is genuine. The $450,000 is safely tucked away in an account they can never touch, serving as the foundation for a life that belongs entirely to us. I spent 30 years believing that being a good daughter meant being a sacrificial lamb, but the audit taught me a harder truth. Blood is just a biological fact. It isn't a contract, and it certainly isn't thicker than a bank statement when the people sharing your DNA are treating you like a business interest. I don't feel guilty anymore. I used to lie awake wondering if I was being too cold, but then I remember the gift letter, with my forged signature, and the image of my father screaming about groceries through a camera lens. You cannot save people who view your survival as an obstacle to their luxury. My parents are currently adjusting to life in that one-bedroom apartment, learning for the first time what it feels like to live within their means. They call it a tragedy, I call it a balanced budget. I've stopped mourning the childhood home they sold, because a house is just wood and stone. The real home is the peace of mind I bought back with that settlement. I've moved on in every sense of the word. I've changed my number, bought a house they'll never find, and for the first time in 30 years. The silence is beautiful. But don't think for a second that the rest of the family took this lying down. While my parents were packing their boxes, my Aunt Linda, the one who called me a monster, decided she was going to take matters into her own hands and recoup the family losses by targeting my business directly. She thought she was being clever, but she forgot one thing. I still have the rest of the spreadsheets. But wait until you hear what that aunt did next.